Yeah, it's kind of hot and cold. Like there's people who I think engage with this politically pretty frequently. So like for them, and I find that we have really fruitful conversations around the work. Where they're like, "Oh yeah, I know this area," and they're like honestly like filling in like details I didn't quite know about. Like, "Oh, did you know that they're planning to do this there, and this other company is going to come in," or little kind of tidbits like that. But other times I'll have folks who are just like, "Well, this is what made us like Montana, or like made us like you know this whatever insert Western town name," and like it's so ingrained into the cultural identity. I think looking back on it with any kind of critique feels pretty volatile to them. Like I had a chat just a couple days ago with a woman from an area that I had photographed recently, like looking at an image from it, and it was hard for her to feel like there was trust between us because she's seeing this as I'm criticizing like your cultural identity in this negative light. Yet I think that there's like bridges between that we can kind of agree on, right?
Welcome to the show, Ryan.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Go ahead and introduce yourself. Give us a little bit about of your background, and I'll let you take it from here.
Yeah, my name is Ryan Parker. I'm based in Bozeman, Montana. Yeah, my background in art and photography is pretty kind of diverse. I kind of have a non-traditional track, um, but I primarily work in lens-based media now. So anything from experimental filmmaking, a lot of still imagery. I tend to work between like large format, color photography, black and white, digital. I tend to not be so discerning with like media, more in terms of like how it gets used. So a lot of that kind of comes from like a background in like a formal art education from where I went to in University of Wyoming, where it was learning traditional bronze casting alongside oil painting and working in the darkroom and kind of really
Wow.
focused on an interdisciplinary approach to making art, which like now I've since kind of given up painting and only do kind of sculpture through like installation and certain facets. But a lot of that like kind of has informed my photographic practice and how I think of material and how that relates to image, especially within like the four kind of boundaries of that frame, right? Especially thinking about like how planar a photograph is and how that translates. So.
Wow. You had mentioned bronze casting. You did bronze casting.
Yeah. Yeah. When I
Wow,
was
that's
an
fantastic.
undergraduate, we would throw up a full leather suit, face shield, and pour hundreds and hundreds of pounds of hot metal.
That actually, to me, I'm like really intrigued by that. Actually, it's something
Yeah.
I've always dreamed of. It's that and glass blowing. I think that I would
Oh,
probably
yeah.
be the most interested in. But I do have a question for you. It's kind of related
Yeah.
to before you became a photographer. You have a great backstory. It's a really interesting backstory. So, kind of talk to us a little bit about before you were a photographer and got into art, who you were, and then how you got there.
Oh, yeah. It's definitely a non-traditional approach. I feel like when I was in art school, so many of my friends were like, took art classes in high school or middle school and like from a young age have been involved in it. I kind of came from a different trajectory. At the time I took my first art class, I was working at a bank as like a supervisor at a small like grocery store branch while studying business at a community college in Wyoming, and really had no, I should say like idea of what art could be or how it was used outside of any kind of stereotype that you might see or think of. So I took my first art class at like 20, and it was taking this black and white darkroom photo class that the school offered, mostly to cover like an art elective. But it was kind of interesting for me and like how it changed how I thought about what photography was and how we worked with it. Because I'd used digital cameras and point and shoot cameras and stuff like that before, but spending that time in the darkroom, like working on a print, developing my own film, and like laying that out over a light table was pretty transformative for me at the time. Enough that I was able to slowly start taking all the photo classes they offered and like stop showing up to some of my business classes and kind of abandon that kind of area of my life in some ways. And then after I think about 18 months of that, I like decided like, all right, we're going to drop out of business school and move to another university and just focus really intensely on art and figuring out what that is. Um, which is sort of what brought me into like a pretty interdisciplinary program because I didn't necessarily know what sculpture was outside of like a public statue you might see in town. So that kind of deep dive into
Yeah.
those processes really like informed how I think about them.
I think it's really interesting. But also, you had a, I was reading an interview about you, and um, you were your dad used to you were a military kid, and you
Yeah.
moved around a lot, and part of I guess part of your father's job was taking photos, or was it just a part of his personal life? I'm not sure, but some way he taught you how to put film in a camera. And is that kind of where your fascination start? Talk to me about that early interest
Oh
of
yeah, yeah.
photography.
Yeah, I think that was definitely like why I chose photography over anything else at that time. It was like I have this like distinctive memory of being a child in a hotel room and my dad, I think we were probably like on vacation or somewhere, especially like growing up in a military family, like, my dad was deployed a lot. So if he was here for 1 or 2 weeks, it was like you're spending all your time you
Yeah.
can with dad before he gets deployed again. And we're sitting in this hotel room and he's like loading a roll of film in the back of his like Canon 81, which he used for work kind of with what he was doing for the military. So like we always kind of had it around. I always remember kind of seeing him with it and packing it. But like that time he like just sat down and like showed me how to load that roll of film before we went out. And I think we went to the beach or something. Like the day wasn't as memorable as like just sitting there in like that subdued hotel room as he's showing me this. That really like brought out a lot of like tactile nostalgia as I kind of got into photography or like that. I
Yeah.
feel like we all over romanticize our first roll of film, but for me, it was like building this language between me and my father through that. Even like now, like
Yeah.
the number
Yeah.
of times I'll call him when I'm going out somewhere to work on a project, I'm like, hey, do you want to come out in the desert for 2 weeks while I'm photographing this thing? And we can like kind of connect through this medium.
What does he say?
Sometimes he's
Does
like,
he join you?
absolutely. And other times he's like, yeah, last summer we went out to the Red
Oh,
Desert in
wow.
Wyoming. Like he rented a camp trailer through the base that he still works on. And we just like set it up in the desert and I'm like driving around with him in his big Ford pickup truck out in the desert, and we're just like making photos of things that like for my father and like his kind of how he uses photography was like, why are we photographing this dead coyote on the side of the road that some poacher shot? And I'm just like, well, like I'm walking him through the composition, all of that kind of stuff. And like he kind of gets like the narrative tools of photography, but he's often like, okay, like by the end of the week he gets it. And the first couple of days he's like, what is this? What's actually in the frame? And then I'll like bring him under the dark cloth with me and he can kind of like, okay, I can kind of see, but it's like that kind of back and forth conversation of it that I find really interesting in many ways. And I mean, it's something that I do with a lot of friends, right? We go out, we photograph. I find it's like very
Sure.
useful to our medium. It seems so solitary, but like it's really collaborative. And like, I find like everyone wants to
It
talk to you
can
about their
be.
photographs,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. It's so true. I remember the AE one. I have one of those,
Yeah.
and that thing is a tank. And but
Yeah.
I was reading that in your interview, and I can immediately connected to it. It was almost like you said in that interview that you had grabbed that camera and jumped into a photography course. And I'm curious,
Yeah.
is that course what kind of said, what, I'm going to art school, or what did it for you?
Yeah, I think for me it was like, I mean, the class itself, when I'm looking back on it, it seemed like very much your textbook, like photo one in the darkroom class, but we had a really like motivational instructor teaching it. Who was just like, for him, he just wanted people to fall in love with photography. So he gave us every opportunity to do so. And like, I think back about my time there and like so much of it was just like making terrible prints in the darkroom, trying to like figure out contrast filters and like all of that stuff, getting into toning and figuring out like
Yeah.
what selenium does on a print versus like gold chloride and the kind of tactile qualities of it. But yeah, so much of it was like understanding photography, not as like this two-dimensional visual thing, but like this object that I work with and have a relationship to for the first time was really powerful.
Gotcha. I was sitting in business school
Yeah.
as well, and I remember I said this on another interview
It's
too, and I was talking about how I took one class and I was like, "This just isn't for me," but I didn't know that I was into art yet. I kind of it took me a long time to kind of find my way here.
I find it amazing how many like former business school people and like nurses I run into in this field.
Yeah, yeah. Well, there's this moment where it switches in you, and you go, "Oh, I'm doing the
Yeah.
wrong thing." And I'm
Yeah.
kind of curious when that moment was for you. Was it that course?
I don't know if it happened that semester, but like within that year, like I knew like I was starting to like spend every Friday in the dark room where it's like, all right, it opens at 7:30. I'll be there by like 7:45 because chemistry will be mixed and it closes at 10. So I'll just like hang out all day. And like I was, working at a bank, so like for me, like what my colleagues were doing was like going skiing on the weekends or like snowmobiling. That kind of like that was how they spent their kind of like extra money, if you will. So like for me, I was just buying photographic paper and like, well, it's cheaper than ski pass. I can go in the dark room and like print all day on Friday. And for me, I think that's where like that that desire to continue it came from. And by the time I was like, all right, let's walk away from taking classes on marketing and accounting and like really look at the history of art, look at other art mediums. I think for me, in many ways, like it was just like the gateway drug. So I remember like going through like a year in art school where I was like, oh, I'm
Gotcha.
going to be a painter. That's like what serious artists do. And then like getting to grad school and be like, this is not how I want to spend my time.
When I look back at that interview, you had mentioned two people that were very influential to you, and I'm curious what it was about these two people that actually kept you number one where you are, and also how they kept you in art. What was it about their guidance and teaching?
Yeah. So the two people were Bailey Russell and Patrick Kekit. They're two of my professors when I was at University of Wyoming. Pat was like the weirdest person I'd ever met at that point in my life. He was just like your stereotypical like artist dude who was like from LA, but like spent his whole life like in the Rocky Mountain West between like Santa Fe, Colorado, Wyoming. So he would wear like weird colored pants with like cowboy boots and a cowboy hat, and then just be like painting like the most minimalist scene I'd ever seen. And you're just like trying to like understand this guy. But like so much of his teaching wasn't like, here's how to paint or mix colors or hold a brush. It was like, here's how to be an artist and like what that lifestyle means and like how to present yourself and like care about things the way an artist would, which for me was like so
Gotcha.
crucial coming out of like business school, and it was like I remember a lot of his like one-on-one kind of mentoring ship was like, well, this is like kind of how you spend your time as an artist. If you're like going out on camping or something, like here's how to like pack your artist backpack. So like maybe it has your camera and a sketchbook or some other tools. And at points in my career, especially early on when I was like, what am I doing? I'm like in this weird space and I don't know how to like photograph what I see here. I like found myself going back to just like, okay, we're going to break out the sketchbook. We're going to draw something as a way to understand what I'm seeing and like think about it further and like use those kind of artistic tools and methods to kind of translate visually what I'm seeing and experiencing. And then often those are getting retranslated into other ways that I can present that idea to someone else. But for me, it was like that first person to like really kind of show you how that happened versus like, here's how to mix color, here's the basic, elements of design. I don't think I ever once heard him bring up those kind of things. And the entire time I like studied under him. And then Bailey Russell was actually my
Interesting.
photo teacher at University of Wyoming. Um, we're still pretty close. We actually just taught a workshop together. Gosh, like 2 months ago now. Um, but for me, he was a similar kind of figure. Like he was like the most economical instructor I'd ever had with words in terms of like getting straight to the point of an image. which for me like was mind blowing. It was like, how can you look at a set of four pictures and like be that precise with your language? So for me, it really showed me like one, like how you can kind of craft photographs in different ways, but also just like different ways that they communicate ideas. So I think I went from being pretty busy and like haptic with how my photography was to something that felt a bit more kind of precise.
What kind of topics do you get drawn to? Where do you find yourself pointing the camera?
Yeah, that's always a tough question for me because I feel like the topics that most interest me, like if you were to go through like my bookshelf of photo books, or like where people are the subjects, right? Like maybe it's straight portraits, or maybe it's like this kind of cultural study
Really?
of like a place or a town. Yeah. Yet I don't make a lot of portraits anymore. I found myself like
Yeah, I
kind of
don't see
pulling
them. I
away
was going
from
to
that a
ask you
bit.
that.
Yeah.
That's wow. Okay.
Yeah. But I think like the way that I've like dealt with that is like finding landscapes, and I work a lot in that kind of mode or that genre, if you will, of
Yeah.
representation. And I look for things that like describe that kind of human condition or experience, or like show us signifiers of what's happening to the people in the community. And I found it really fascinating and how like that area of representation in many ways tells me more about a town or a place than just like creating that portrait of someone or sitting down like for that kind of session.
I've noticed a connection to the land. I've noticed a connection to our relationship to land. I notice a lot of times when I've read about you before, you talk about humans' influence on it. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah. I mean, gosh, yeah. For me, it's like looking for those little marks that like tell me that like kind of humans exist in this space. I often think of like, especially with where we're at in the Anthropocene, of like finding a spot on Earth that hasn't been altered or changed by humankind is like really near impossible. Even if you like get to like the furthest reaches of a glacier, you're still going to find like that trace of microplastics or ash from megafires. So for me, it's like kind of analyzing that, right? So like maybe it's something as simple as like a cargo container where we're just looking at like, here's this object that I could find from somewhere in South Africa to Japan to, you know, somewhere here in Montana. And how does that object and how we utilize it tell us what's happening globally to the people who interact with it? So like I often like think about how kind of standardized those objects are and how they appear, but they like as basic as that object is, it tells me so much more about what's happening. Like actually if we share the screen for a second, I can kind of show you two examples of this. So yeah, when I started really kind of thinking about using landscape to represent kind of communities, like it all kind of started from this kind of long drive I did one Valentine's Day after moving to Montana, where I'd spent the day kind of just like getting out of Dodge, going out, just kind of driving up near kind of Helena, or kind of state capital, heading back down through Butte and just some of the kind of more distinctive towns in central Montana. And on the way back, I passed like three open pit mines, multiple kind of like railroads, all that heavy industry that butted right up against the edges of towns. And it felt like pretty overwhelming in terms of what you could represent. But as I like kind of came back to town, I found myself stopping by the river just to like get away, like be in nature, right? And we'll kind of use that as the space for its regenerative kind of stereotypes we'll talk about it with. And I just found myself sitting across this river from like these cargo containers that were just like just sitting there on the edge and like wondering, how does a cargo container that's designed to like carry merchandise from a factory in China to a port in LA just like end up in a field in Montana up against some trees? And the more I looked into it, like you find out that like cargo containers like fluctuate on if it's worth selling at their like end destination or shipping them back empty depending on how the market's doing. So like anytime you see those trendy like cargo container homes, there's like something pretty volatile happening in the market. So like this image here is like from where someone purchased one of those at its like end destination pretty cheap and then converted it into this end of the world survival shelter. So like they're using the same object that, you know, Target uses to get clothing and soap, but now they have repurposed it to be this gateway into an underground bunker that they can survive, like, the coming apocalypse, which for me I found really fascinating and became like the main kind of
That is
curiosity,
fascinating.
where like a portrait of someone who like does this, I'm like, yeah, it's interesting, but like this tells me so much more about what they believe, how they like spend their time, and what they value. So I'll jump out of that really quick. Yeah, I know it's kind of a long
Of
answer.
course. So it almost seems like you're kind of, are you doing this alone?
Yeah, sometimes it's alone, and sometimes I'm like going out with people. My preference is to like find someone who wants to come with me, and just like go see
Yeah.
this weird place. Like that photo of the cargo container, I think I visited it like probably 6 times throughout the year, just like seeing how much snow is on it, kind of looking at like when the aesthetics would like kind of highlight what I saw in it. And like for some of those trips, I was alone, but for like the time I finally went out and made the picture, my fiance came out with me. She's also a photographer, so like it's much easier to rope her into like the, hey, do you want to drive 2 hours to this weird bunker on a hill somewhere? And she's usually like, okay, yeah, I can do that. Um, but other
I'm
times
just
I'm
gonna
like
say
meeting up
that's
with
kind of
people
a
in
strange thing to
towns.
ask someone. Yeah.
I'm very lucky, and it definitely goes both ways. She made a lot of work about mega fires and was like, "Hey, will you drive to Oregon with me to like visit this like burned down forest that I was photographing last fall?" And I was like, "Okay, that's a 12-hour drive. Okay,
Sure.
I'm down. Let's do this."
So the random bunker in the woods is not so strange. I understand. I understand.
Yeah.
My next question is what artists do you follow any artists? Do you have any influences? What artists inspire you?
Yeah, I feel like I'm a bit of a photo nerd when it comes to that. Like, there's so many photographers I look at and have met, and especially like with the way like social media functions now, like I'm just exposed to so much more than I think I would have even like 10 years ago. I mean, everyone from like Mark Power, like that Good Morning America series he's working on, really like fascinates me and like makes me really rethink a lot of like quotidian places I interact with. Folks like Robin Friend, his project Bastard Countryside, really, really kind of inspired me, especially when I was a little bit younger as an artist. When that work was just coming out, I was like, yeah, this is exactly like how I see this place I live. But even like early on, I mean, there's so many, like it's that kind of endless list, right? Um, but even folks like, yeah, gosh, there's so many trying to like sort through. And yeah, folks like
I'm
Rob
going through your
Hornstra,
playlist right now. That's
those kind of guys. Yeah, it's literally like going through
yeah,
your like Spotify like Wrapped for the year of like, oh yeah, how much time did I spend with
exactly.
this artist or this artist? But even folks like Nadav Kander, I mean, I found like early on as a student, his work was like really helpful in like bridging, moving out of portraiture into more landscape work and like thinking about the connections between those. Um, and then also like a lot of authors is really how I like kind of figured it out and felt like I could develop a confident voice. Like Liz Wells has a really fantastic book that's now back in print, all on landscape, which like for me became like a seminal text when I was in grad school, trying to like understand like how land aesthetics convey ideas of culture. It was like for me just like the kind of quintessential text on that. Yeah,
So does is how much does research play into your practice?
quite a bit. I mean, it's pretty 50-50. Often like when I think of a project that I start, it starts out like somewhere between like, a screen like this looking at maps or a site visit to somewhere that like I heard about, like that cargo container we were just looking at. I was just like scrolling through Facebook Marketplace looking at like what's happening with real estate property in Montana, which is a really hot button issue, and I came across like this listing for like end of the world shelter slash like, and then it had this long adventure thing of like purposes you could use it for, right? So it was literally for sale when I found it, and I was like, this is fascinating. I need to go here and like see this and like exist with it for a minute and just think about like why this is, you know. Um, so for me, it's like somewhere between those two. But often once I like go, I do that site visit, I see kind of what I'm dealing with and like learn a bit more about it through
Yeah.
either just like chatting with people or what I can find on the internet. I'll tend to like come back with a more dedicated plan to photograph.
I'm curious about what inspires you to photograph something. I'm kind of curious the deeper meaning for it. Why
Yeah.
are you so
I think,
fascinated by a container that is turned into this shelter per se? I'm kind of curious. What is it? Is it our time? Is it the news? What is it that
yeah.
draws you to these things?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I feel like as much as I want to relate it to like current trends, like in the economy or like what's happening in the news, like so much of it for me is like on a much more personal level with like growing up on military bases. I was surrounded by like fences, cargo containers, pallets of equipment. And like for me, it's like there's this like nostalgic memory of like seeing those objects in the way that for some people who grew up on like one neighborhood their whole life, they know like every crack in the sidewalk. For me, like moving every few years, I didn't necessarily have that. I had like, oh hey, there's another like camouflage like container. Yeah, that feels like home. That's like near where I used to go to school. Even though the landscape is completely different, for me, it has those kind of connections to it.
So you're almost finding your childhood in a way, and you're finding
Yeah,
your roots in a way. I think that's
yeah,
interesting because I do remember a lot of times when you would move in the military from my family's past experience, they you would put your stuff on a pallet and you would pack these big pallets and they would ship them to where you were going next. And so whatever fit on the pallet
yeah.
went, you know. It's
Yeah, I
fascinating.
know that for sure. We had lived in Japan for a little while as a kid, and like we had a bunch of stuff not make it when we moved going there. And then when it finally got there, like 6 months later, they're like, "Yeah, maybe the container like fell in the water or something because everything was water damaged, and it was just like came in a weird condition." So
That's insane. That's absolutely insane. So I can see you photographing, and I see you finding these interesting things. I'm kind of seeing your inspiration. Why do you take on the challenge of a large format camera? Because it takes a lot of
yeah,
setup.
that's a great
It's
question. Yeah, it's not. Yeah, it's not an easy camera to deal with. There's a lot of kind of parts. It's really
no.
slow. They're heavy and clunky. Traveling with them requires a lot of like thoughtfulness in terms of what you can actually bring. Um, but for me, there's like this, I mean, there's all the stereotypes, right? Of like, oh, you slow down, it like gives you a bigger negative, all that. But for me, there's like these private moments you get when you use that camera versus a camera that you hold in your hands. Or like once you set up the camera and it's facing whatever you're going to photograph, you throw on a dark cloth and it like separates you from the landscape you're in, from the people that you're surrounded by, and you get this really private moment where you're just like looking at your ground glass, kind of composing upside down and backwards. And for just a few moments, it's just like you and the edges of a frame. And of course, you got to get back from under your dark cloth, load film, and like deal with everything going on around you. But you get those few moments where it's just like kind of you and the object. Kind of reminds me of like when you're in the dark room, just like trying to make a print. It's just like you and this like silver gelatin paper. And I feel like especially when you're out photographing and there's a lot of people around, there's always like these eyes on you, right? Like if you're trying to make a photograph in a park and you have a camera in your hand, people are kind of questioning what you're doing there. Not that they don't if you have a view camera set up, but like I feel like you're much more aware of it. Like you kind of connect to that gaze in a different way. And if you're able to just like, okay, I'm going to go under the cloth for a moment and work on some stuff here. But it comes at like a contrast too, right? Like often when I'm photographing at night and I'm alone, that comfort kind of goes away and there's a lot of fear that you get because like maybe you hear footsteps on the ice and you're like, I thought I was alone in this place. What am I actually hearing? So it causes some discomfort, but it definitely centers you with like the object and the image that you're making for sure. And I sort of wish I didn't. use that as much. Like, getting through TSA would be a lot easier if I wasn't trying to hand them like a stack of film. But
You're like, hey, this cannot go through the X-ray. It cannot.
yeah,
Um, no, I
yeah,
understand. No, I'm trying to connect the dots between that first finding yourself in the dark room all the time, from open to
hmm
close to the finding yourself in you referenced, just for a moment, you put that cloth over you. What do you think you're looking for under there? Why are you drawn to that?
oh yeah. I mean,
I'm
I
going
think
deep
it's
here.
yeah.
I'm
I
digging
mean,
deeper.
yeah, man. You have to send me the therapy bill for this. But I think the like as soon as you like go under, right? It's that separation. Like you're not forced to like be seen anymore. And I think like
Gotcha.
maybe it was different years ago where like you could be a photographer and be somewhat anonymous. But now with like how oversaturated our image culture is, and I've heard other photographers talk about like projects where they road trip across America and everything went fine. And I feel like more and more I hear about weird confrontations where someone was, making a photograph of a monument in a town or like a park, and someone came up to them really aggressively, like, "Why are you here? What are you doing?" And I think for me, it's like that metaphorical shield that I'm literally putting up, right? Like, okay, well, I'm just going to be under here for a moment so I can breathe and just focus on this one aspect of photography, and then like get back to dealing with like, okay, why is this group of people approaching me, and what are they concerned that I'm doing here?
That is so true. Photography has changed a lot, and I think our image culture has changed our relationship with that relationship with the photographer and in the world. We're always now suspicious of them. Whereas I do remember a time when you could have somebody being a photographer and they would almost blend into the background. You didn't even care that they were there. It's just somebody with their hobby,
Yeah.
And so that's it's
Mhm.
really interesting that you say that.
I feel like the next generation like is doing better with that in some ways, because like I find the photographs that like my students are willing to like engage with so much more beyond like what I would have done as a student, and like kind of worrying about like those kind of conflicts. Like my students will approach a stranger on the street like at 2 a.m. in downtown in a heartbeat for a portrait. And I'm like, I don't think I would have done that in school. I would have been a little bit worried about like what might happen. But so like I have faith it's like coming back to that kind of older culture where like people felt a little bit more comfortable with cameras being around. But
So let's go ahead and take a moment to dive into one of your projects. I know you have queued up for us one particular project that is I really really enjoyed looking at, and I'll give you an opportunity to kind of set it up and say what it is and kind of give a background and take us through the images. I'm kind of curious about what your visual language is and how you explore it, and I have a few questions as we go too. So we can go ahead and share now if you would like.
yeah, so I have kind of a handful of images from a series called Hinterland. Um, the name sort of relates back to like how we used to think of like the area beyond a port, right? So if we think about,
Okay.
maybe I'll just pull up this image really quick because it's relevant for this. If you think about like the idea of like flyover country in the United States, like that area between the coasts and like everything in the middle, people kind of forget about. I mean, like Minnesota kind of gets tied into that group sometimes too. But I think a lot about like those
Yeah.
objects that kind of connect it. And the idea of a hinterland is like everything kind of beyond the port, right? And like kind of going into the etymology of that, like I found it really, really strong in how it like connected rural communities. So in working in this project, I was really wondering like, okay, what is the hinterland that I'm occupying here? What kind of connects it? So we have the container obviously as an object that does this. We also have heavy industry, right? Like this is the kind of part of the country where they're going to set up oil refinement. So this is from a couple towns over in Billings, Montana, where you're going to have 3 or 4 refineries because that's the main economy of that town and becomes the backbone of it. So I got really curious into like, okay, what if this is what's providing the jobs for people and the stability? What does that look like, and how do we interact and live with places like this? To thinking about like what gets left over, right now, if you were to come to Bozeman, Montana, this is sort of what it's going to look like. There's going to be some condos, some new construction going on over where they condemned like a business that maybe been there for 30 years. And you're going to see a lot of cranes and a lot of that construction of trying to create this new vision of big sky country. Yet, if you were to go to one of those heavy extraction towns, you're going to find, one of the largest kind of brick structures in Northern America from Anaconda, Montana, where they did all the smelting for copper in the United States for a good chunk of the 20th century. And you're going to have these kind of leftovers mixing at the same time as we're trying to like transform this kind of formerly pretty agrarian place. So this image is part of the Butte Area Superfund site. It's simply a creek that goes where they used to store a lot of slag and tailings. When I first got here, I got really kind of fascinated with like, oh, it must just be like a lava flow, right? Like it has that same kind of structure. Maybe they had to carve a creek through it or something like that. And then I was having lunch, chatting with some people. They were like, oh yeah, no, that's all slag. And like going back to the days I was like pouring metal in my sculpture class, I was like, that's just like the top skin that's oxidized, and I've never seen that like accumulate more than like the palm of my hand. And now there's like this giant tunnel created with that. So like the scale of like what was left behind is like in that kind of agrarian extractive kind of culture really fascinated me. So much of this work was trying to understand its cultural identity through the kind of objects that have been left behind and the kind of new things being constructed. So now, like you go around, you see a lot of those signifiers for that construction, the rezoning. So something as simple as like a fence that, growing up on a military base, you're surrounded by totally makes sense. You're often, especially overseas, trying to designate what's, US government property, what is, the local culture in Okinawa. And like there's this physical barrier between those. So finding so many of these in this part of the country, I found really surprising because it wasn't, we're not in this infrastructure of safety and like separating military from, the domestic space around it. It's like, people are here to ski and like farm. And then, so what's the purpose of like a fence such as this? And for me, a lot of it is just really trying to like connect those dots. So now you're getting a lot more of those like kind of luxury condos and apartments and trying to like find the kind of union between that architecture and the sawmill a town over and like kind of connecting those two things together. And often as I'm doing this, like I think about photographs often and what we put them next to. So I kind of pull up some like kind of mock-ups of things I've played around with where I'm literally trying to like layer images next to each other on a wall to kind of convey that meaning of what it's like to walk through the space, right? So you'd have this larger image with this kind of architectural design where we're like putting boards into it so it picks up that wood grain texture next to the actual like stacks of them at a sawmill that go into these apartments, and then the kind of wraps that get stuck in trees that cover those pallets, and really trying to like look at this in the way you might think of like collage or installation in that way, where I have these multiple nodes about what's happening culturally in the economy in a town and how can I bring those back together. And kind of give you one kind of more example with that. It's from a recent show I was in that just opened a couple weeks ago. And you can sort of see like how I play with this in a physical space. So to give you that idea of walking through the land, I'm going to take that smelting tower and this mountain of slag that's sitting in front of it that they're in the process of mediating by recovering with topsoil, and essentially lay out this kind of photo text behind that image. So when you put the two together, you can see the dust that's blowing over where they've already mediated with like the essential like cause on top of it. So in the rest of the work, really kind of bounces back and forth between that. So things as simple as like the modes of transport on an interstate system, because we're not so tied to the railway anymore, at least in terms of like our quotidian landscape. When you go through Montana, it's often like the semi trucks that you think of passing on I-90, or the kind of detritus that happens between those. So it's kind of like a quick kind of overview of what I'm like thinking about with it. There's, I think I've been working on this project for almost like 7 years now, and I might pop out of this for a second.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of images that I'm kind of going through, and like the whole wall kind of behind my computer here is just contact sheets, and like looking at those connecting points between them and how those explain that narrative a little bit of that transition from agrarian to our kind of current economy that's leaning more towards tourism, thinking of nature as this beautiful aesthetic resource we should have, but we're now doing that over top of like open pit mining that like faces the highway. And kind of how does that change our identity culturally here?
I was interviewing someone previously before, and they were doing work like this, and they were doing a lot of our human interaction with the landscape itself. And big sky country is it's what they call it out there in Montana. It's just absolutely gorgeous. You could literally take a beautiful photo almost everywhere you walk. And what's interesting about what you're doing is that you're choosing to focus on something else. And when you choose to focus on our human impact on land, sometimes that can have, when I've seen in the past, it kind of has an effect on you. Has that had an effect on you? Has it changed your opinion on certain things? And if it has, what are they?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I feel like when you work in this vein, whether it be like through landscape or even through portraiture or working with communities that have been impacted by Superfund sites, like it's really easy to kind of lose hope, right? Of like, oh yeah, we're gonna be fine. I mean, gosh,
You call it
yeah.
Superfund site?
Yeah,
Is that what you call it?
yeah, yeah. So it's called a Superfund site, essentially meaning that like irreparable damage has happened to an area's ecology that like no amount of money can fix it. It's sort of like the general idea. So, like if you can imagine where there's been a huge oil spill, right? Like on a beach or something,
Ah,
like at a certain point, if it enters the water table, there's not a lot we can do. Like that's there now, especially when we start thinking about longer time cycles, like thinking of like how our culture exists on a geologic time scale. Suddenly, like, oh, we had a refinery here. What do
yeah.
we put there now? Well, you can't put any buildings on top because the off gassing is going to like basically give people migraines, cause cancers in the long term. So, and I think it started off as like kind of a sarcastic comment in the 70s or 80s, but someone with the EPA was like, oh, we'll put a golf course there. And now, if you drive through the American West, you can almost find where they've done either like oil or copper smelting or like oil and gas refinement, because there'll just be this golf course in this weird part of town. And you're like, why is that there? I mean, you'll find it in Anaconda, Casper, I think even Cheyenne. Like, pretty, I mean, it's hard to go to town without being like, oh, that's where they used to do this. Or maybe they were coating like telephone pole lines that had like a sludge that had arsenic and some other heavy kind of chemicals in them. So often they'll refer to those as a Superfund just because trying to mediate it becomes near impossible. So, but there is growth in that area. I think the one in Anaconda, they're in the process of at least trying to isolate it so that dust isn't blowing into town. It's not getting into other aspects of the water. But it's definitely a volatile idea we have to kind of deal with when we start thinking about, okay, 10,000 years from now, what's going to happen here? And how is that going to affect the peoples and animals and ecology? Like I was a part of this kind of global art intervention a couple years ago called Extraction Art at the Edge of the Abyss that essentially tried to tackle that a little bit. So a bunch of artists from around the world got together to make work, share works, from photography to painting to poetry and installations and films, all kind of sparked by this forecast of when the Berkeley Pit, which essentially it's a Superfund site in Butte, Montana, where they had a almost mile deep open pit mine that they shut the pumps off when the original company went bankrupt. So it's slowly filled with water. But the pH of that water is around 2, and it's full of all kinds of heavy metals they used to be extracting. And it was a slowly approaching the water table. So the idea was like 2021 when it was forecasted to hit the water table without mediation. They've since added some mediation to kind of keep it below that threshold, but artists from around the world got together to kind of like try to bring attention, raise awareness to this, and really kind of use that community kind of crowd idea of like, if we're all thinking about this right now, maybe we can start thinking about those long-term ramifications into the future a little bit better.
That's fascinating. Actually, it's I've been looking at a lot of this kind of work, and I'm always curious about. And I was pointing at it with my previous question, and I'm curious about the effects on you.
Mhm.
How have you changed
Yeah.
your mind? How has it affected you looking at this kind of stuff?
It's caused me to censor a little bit of what I would normally like show or photograph in some ways. Like I remember a couple of years ago, I was sitting down showing someone some photographs and we were talking and like they kind of had a similar question. They're like, "How are you doing with this?" And like they could kind of like tell like, there's a kind of depression that you get in if you think about these things too much. And I was definitely like
Easily.
in feeling that burden. And and now, like often when I'm thinking about a site that I want to photograph, I factor that in. So I'm getting ready to fly down to Tennessee to photograph this old ammunition depot that's been converted into a public park. And my interest in that kind of comes from looking at, okay, where have we actually mediated and the public can use it again? And this is safe for the local ecology. Because like there's only so many times you can like kind of look at the edge of the abyss, right? Before you're going to go crazy. So it's like you kind of have to look back to like, okay, where are the good examples of
Yeah.
where we've done this right? And I just kind of stumbled upon one down in just outside of Chattanooga, Tennessee. So I was going to kind of spend some time there, just like kind of reflecting. And I've already kind of done some research online. I've visited the site once and walked around and was like, this feels so much like every military base I grew up on. Yet I'm not afraid of like what's in the soil, which is amazing. So often,
Yeah.
like you find a site like that, and they're like, okay, well, mercury, if you see any water, don't walk into it because it rises, right? So you're going to be getting exposed to that, especially with like ammunition depots. There's so many heavy metals that like end up there. So it's nice to kind
Yeah.
of find that one hopeful moment and kind of immerse in that, especially to kind of have that back and forth between kind of the brutal reality of when it goes wrong versus like no, there is some ways that we can like think about this in a longer term way that doesn't impact us for that many future generations.
So you found yourself trying to find a balance to see if there's some kind of other type of hope and finding
Yeah.
evidence for that.
Oh yeah, just like trying to find hope, I think as an artist is really important. Otherwise it's really easy to kind of just get like too isolated.
It's a tough subject. When you realize what big business can do, especially to a place, especially out there in Montana where people don't think anyone is looking, and so it's interesting for you to kind of take that moment to look to provide that perspective and to provide it for everyone. I'm curious what the reception is like when you show this kind of work.
Yeah, it's kind of hot and cold. Like there's people who I think engage with this politically pretty frequently. So like for them, and I find that we have really fruitful conversations around the work. Where they're like, "Oh yeah, I know this area," and they're like honestly like filling in like details I didn't quite know about. Like, "Oh, did you know that they're planning to do this there, and this other company is going to come in," or little kind of tidbits like that. But other times I'll have folks who are just like, "Well, this is what made us like Montana, or like made us like this whatever insert Western town name," and like it's so ingrained into the cultural identity. I think looking back on it with any kind of critique feels pretty volatile to them. Like I had a chat just a couple days ago with a woman from an area that I had photographed recently, like looking at an image from it, and it was hard for her to feel like there was trust between us because she's seeing this as I'm criticizing like your cultural identity in this negative light. Yet I think that there's like bridges between that we can kind of agree on, right? Like, and I'll actually pull up another image here really quick, um, because I
Wow,
find
that
like
is a
it interesting
great
who.
contrast.
Pull this up here.
Wow.
So
Okay,
like
here.
when I'm photographing sites like this, often people are like, "Oh, well, you're doing this for political reasons, right? You're photographing a refinery because like refineries are bad." And really, like, I found them beautiful before I was a photographer. There's something gorgeous about light at night like this. I think that's like a bridge that even if you're very pro energy, pro oil extraction, like we can kind of bond over how beautiful these places are at night and like begin a bridge and dialogue, even though I might want to see less oil being used and like kind of switch over to other more clean energies. There is like common ground here. And when I was in undergrad, I was out photographing with a visiting artist who's a South Korean photographer, Taewon Jang. And he did a whole book called Stained Ground, where he's photographing different industrial sites throughout the world, often at night with this kind of glow and atmosphere. Yet when we went out to Sinclair, Wyoming, we like pulled off just on the edge of like the public property outside of one of these refineries. And within like 10, 15 minutes, we had the Sinclair PD, the Highway Patrol, the Sheriff's Department, all on us. I think there was like 13 guys in total that responded to us just having a camera set up like on the edge of the property line. And they were just telling us, oh, the company doesn't want you here. You need to leave. And we're like, well, it's public property. Legally, do we have to leave? And they're like, well, legally you don't, but the company doesn't want you here. Like, and they, that kind of rhetoric. And they all end up kind of leaving. We stay on the edge of the property line to kind of make these long exposures at night. And eventually the head of security pops out like on this golf cart. And he's just telling us like, yeah, this is why I love the night shift. Isn't it just beautiful? And I'm like, we just go through all of this with the law enforcement thinking that we're here to do something that like puts their town at risk. And then here's the person who's in charge of security who kind of gets why we're there at night. So for me, I find like trying to promote those dialogues really beneficial.
Wow. I was in a conversation with another artist. It's one of our first episodes on this podcast, and she was in a very small town in Iceland, and she has a boat, these big cruise lines that come in, and they have a population of 400 people, and they drop off 5,000 people in this town, and these people are exploring this place, and the kind of traction and the kind of interaction that comes from that many people showing up on such a regular basis can have an effect on the landscape, the town itself. And she was commenting on that. And she was commenting on that
Yeah, I can.
experience and its effects on nature and so on, our effects on nature. And when she was producing the body of work, and she had kind of she was doing a documentary series on it. She had a experience where it was a mixed bag. Some people were like, well, we need that. We don't have the same industry. We don't have fishing anymore. So we need like tourism to come in and kind of help with the economy here. And so you have this strange thing that's happening where you have like the economy of what's actually happening, but then our actual impacts on that. How does that affect you? Like, do you feel torn? Do you see both sides here as far as this is providing dinner for families, but at the exact same time, are we creating some kind of issue that's irreversible to the landscape? How do you work on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's such a complex problem, right? Like, you obviously need people coming and going. I feel like I might know whose work you're talking about too, because it's an issue that we deal with in
Jessica
Bozeman.
Hour.
So
Yeah.
it's so close to home.
Jessica
Oh yeah,
Hour.
Jessica
Yeah,
Hour.
that's
Yeah,
her name.
absolutely. Yeah, it's just
Yeah,
such a
yeah.
fantastic
She's wonderful.
photographer.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah,
yeah,
she is. She does
but
large
like
format like you.
in Bozeman,
Yes.
Oh, I never realized that. I need to do a deeper dive into her
Yeah.
work. I should watch the episode. But yeah, in Bozeman, it's something that we deal with a lot, right? Like as we're transformed our economy maybe quicker than some of the other towns near us. Like we have the Yellowstone Club, which brings in a lot of tourism, a lot of spillover from the town of Big Sky. So in Bozeman, you have so many businesses that are geared towards like marketing to people that live in the Yellowstone Club or those kind of luxury economies that they want when they're visiting. That idea of coming to Big Sky country to ski. And then by the summer, everything switches gears to Yellowstone. Because while we're not like the closest town, we are one of the more major airports outside of Jackson Hole. So we get so many people that come here just to go see that. Like we're kind of feeling that same pressure of like, what's the right balance? Like how much of this can the infrastructure of the city and people support before the people that actually live here are forced out, and then those who are coming here for vacation are all that are left. And I think when you're looking at like a town that is so reliant on extraction industries having that same conversation, they're like, at what point do we switch from oil and gas to wind turbines and solar? Because, and I've had a lot of friends growing up in Wyoming who like are on both sides of that, where they're like, no, I come from like an oil family, like even just using a wind turbine or like a solar charger, they feel like they're betraying like their bloodline or something. Yet I've had friends who like left the oil and gas industry to go work in the wind farms because they're like, yeah, it pays better. I can like buy a house now. And I don't like come home dirty and smelly, full of like all of the stuff I've been exposed to every day. I just have to get over my fear of heights to like climb a tower, which has been an interesting one because there is this very blue collar conversation there that often gets put to the side, I think, sometimes. And I think that's where that combative alienation happens is like someone's real concerns about how they're going to pay their mortgage, be able to raise a family, educate their family, have health care, often are like the primary things they're trying to decide. So like everyone cares when a train derailment happens and suddenly the Yellowstone River is like full of toxic chemicals for a little while. And they say you can't eat the fish anymore. Often that means someone who's living off of the fish they catch isn't eating protein for a little while. So often like that's how dire it is for some of the people in these communities. So it's really, I think, easy to have this conversation above them about, well, we have to have this or that. And often it's so much more nuanced than that.
I think exploring that nuance is something that I wasn't aware of, and I loved ask. Well, I loved your response to that because you actually gave me that kind of balanced kind of perspective. Like, you know, you have those people that are very much activist and they want to kind of change the way we do things, but then you have those people that are trying to survive, and I think that's just very fascinating. And you know, I find myself sometimes kind of thinking about every aspect of this, and it doesn't seem like there's a really easy answer. It's just that we need to all kind of come together and figure out proper solutions that solve all the problems, you know.
Yeah.
And but at the exact same time, I think the work itself calls attention to it, where, you know, it could easily get lost, you know, when you live in those mining towns and you live in those, you know, I lived in Texas, you know, you just get used to the refinery. They almost start blending
Yeah.
in, you know, you forget they're there. You forget that they're alien, you
Yeah.
know, and, to
Yeah.
bring them back out and make it a very apparent that, you know, this is not natural. It's not a part of it. And that one day we're going to have to switch it back. And depending on what that impact is it's hard to fathom, but I think that the work is really, really powerful. My next thing is I know this is what, you know, you have a few projects on your website. This one was like right in the middle. You had one before it and then one after it, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
in the one after
Yeah.
it seemed to you went a little bit more abstract.
Yeah, that room in a weird way was like kind of what started a lot of this. It was this time I spent living in Wyoming on the high plains where like I was working in a lot of different media, so I felt comfortable bouncing around, but I was like making these photographs on the high plains. And for me, I hadn't really experienced anything that was that vast and encompassing. And I really wasn't sure how to photograph it. So I found that I was making a lot of these pictures and really not being satisfied with what the camera was doing, with what I was seeing and feeling, especially as I'm like staying the night, camping for a couple days, just seeing like what this continental divide is like with the local ecology. And I found that like I kept going back to my sketchbook a little bit and just like making these really like simple notations, or there might have just been a simple line drawing with like 4 or 5 marks that showed maybe where horizon line was, maybe where an interesting like glow on a cloud was at night, or some description of how the grass was blowing in the wind. And I spent a good summer just with those drawings thinking about, okay, is this just be a painting? How should I like address like kind of how I'm feeling about this place? So I kind of went back into the dark room, that kind of safety net, right? Where you feel like you aren't visible for this moment and you can kind of meditate on this idea. So I was using these drawings as a reference while creating chemigrams, essentially a cameraless photograph using just the chemicals in the darkroom and photographic paper that's already been exposed to light to create these kind of images. And most of them are fairly atmospheric. It really kind of flirts with the sublime in a lot of
Yeah.
ways, where you have this kind of really intense like darkness with this glow coming over the horizon. But for me, it was just trying to like really spend time thinking, and it was using art making as the process for that. I mean, I think some of those single chemigrams, because I'm not using any chemical resistance to kind of create marks, it's all through folding the paper, altering dilutions and temperatures of the chemistry, sometimes simultaneously mixing it. So my developer is being stopped by the fixer at the same time it's making contact. So you get this wonderful kind of chemical mark that happens with what hit where first. But for me, using that really haptic process to kind of translate what it's like to be in this place that's so open and really inspiring in a lot of ways. But for me, that straight photograph just didn't translate what it felt like to be on the high plains. So I spent a lot of time in that kind of prairie, kind of working on that. And that's really what I think helped me feel more comfortable moving into more large format work, where I could just use that as another kind of segue into that alone time with a camera, looking at a place and trying to handle this in a more pictorial way. And then that other series that's on there is sort of that
I
hopeful
like
like
how you
reprieve, right? Where it's
I like how you almost wanted to try to do that at
yeah,
first, and then you're like, you know what? Let's go to the dark room, see what I can do here. Do you
yeah,
want to take an opportunity to kind of show some of these?
yeah, absolutely. Let me just pull up the website. Yeah, so they're all fairly small in size, not that much bigger than they appear on the screen here, which for me was really important. I wanted this really intimate object that really kind of showed like what it would be like to perceive like just as an individual in an encompassing space. So, and like we get little like highlights in the work, literally from like taking the paper and like bending it as it was drying, so it would tear just ever so slightly. Really kind of leaning into just like how dark something can be. Um,
And so you're getting these by folding.
yeah, so I'm folding the paper in half, sometimes literally ripping it in half. In like the case of this last image, where it was like I just wanted to exaggerate that line a bit more. And it was like, I feel like we get too precious with photo paper, right? Like we're always worried about denting it and
Yeah.
like, oh, if we like fold it too much, it's going to cause this crease. And I was like, but that's just like a little white part of the image. So rather than use like a chemical resist that would like not let chemistry hit that part of the paper, I was like, what if I just like stop being so precious with this and just let it like rip in half as I'm like developing it? And others, it's just as simple as like pouring fixer over one part of the image as developing a solution is coming in from other parts. And often it's pretty diluted, but like fixer's pretty aggressive in removing silver from the paper. So it's going to obscure this area from like going fully black, and you're going to get this kind of clouding, the way that like two chemicals that aren't fully mixed kind of create that kind of cloud in your like cylinders that you're mixing in. You start to kind of see those marks carry. But for me, it like really like was reminiscent of like the clouds on the high plains that just kind of go for the entirety of your horizon.
So when you were doing this, and that's the thing that really I'm intrigued by is The process is fascinating by all in its own because I'm a maker myself, but at the other end is when you pull it out and it's done and you're looking at this thing. You know what I mean? What
Mhm.
is it that
Yeah.
what do you feel like you captured there?
I think for me, it's like this moment, this extended moment, right? Where it's not just like that single frame of what I saw. It's like perceiving time over, course of a few hours on the high plains. Like, which for me, I think looking at these when they're like done and I'm pulling them out and I'll kind of pick one to kind of end on, like just settle on here. Like it's like looking at those like little kind of what almost looks like a flare of light, the way that you might see like light at night with like just little tiny headlights along the highway. And for me, it's like about evoking those memories and that kind of haptic feeling that you might feel in that place. Because it can be rather lonely, but like at the same time, like you feel so connected on a vast geography to everything that's around you. I think like when I talk to like local people in Bozeman who like are all about like climbing to the top of mountains, like they often, I find our experiences are pretty similar. Where like you get to the top of that peak and you can kind of see just how broad everything is and how connected the landscape is. But for me, I just simply experienced it out on the prairie in the high plains of Wyoming.
Wow. So I know you like to think about images in space, and I know you think about them sometimes on a wall and how you would present these. How do you envision presenting these? I know you liked them being small and intimate. How do you
Yeah, I mean,
imagine
for
someone
me,
interacting with an image like this?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think for me, it's like keeping this really small, quiet moment. Like I've always imagined it in like a just really like a very sparse exhibition space with just like a couple small images with a lot of space around it. So like you kind of are forced to look at these really minute details. Something as simple as like just those kind of tears in the paper, or like in here, like it doesn't photograph well, but like in the print itself, like this, there's a fold through here that like has the print raised, and just like how that curve of the paper kind of creates this darker edge here. And for me, I think having a more kind of minimal exhibition with that is how I prefer to show this work.
You know, this could be a book too. Have you thought about it in a book?
I haven't. Yeah, this is one of those projects I worked on back in 2015, and then I put it away for almost 5 years. Like I pulled it out, I think there, like when the pandemic was kicking off, and I was just like, yeah, I think a lot of us were going through our archives, and I was going through old boxes from grad
Yeah.
school, and I found this box of prints, and I was like, oh yeah, I remember when I was just like making this, like back when I just like was trying to figure things out, and I was just like, wow, like this really like it brought me back to like being in that place. So I mean, I think the book works in that level of intimacy where you're just like holding this like small image in your hands and like immersing this moment with it.
You had mentioned that you like photography, not photography, but poetry, and you could definitely make a connection there with this
Yeah.
because it is abstract and it's based on feeling, and you're using that would be an interesting book.
Yeah, I mean, I find poetry is so useful for photographers because I feel like it's the closest art form to what we do, right? Like, it's like taking little fragments and trying to build more meaning out of it, which I think a lot of great poetry is like taking little fragments, sometimes repeating them and using different structures to create a much larger idea than it is. Often I find I read quite a bit of it and it informs different projects.
You had said that this project kind of led you to do more large format work, and I'm kind of curious. And I know you referenced it a little bit in your previous answer, but I kind of want to dig a little deeper. How did this
Mhm.
kind of push you in a new direction?
Yeah, I mean, I think it forced me to think about space and spatial relationships differently. Like, I think before this, I was my photography. It flirted with the cliche a lot. It was definitely very direct and like close up with the things I was photographing. Where, like, when I was making this work, it really helped me think about just like how broad and vast you can kind of approach something. Um, Especially like out west where like you have a huge horizon with just a few little dots of information in it, and it can really convey so much more than just focusing on like hard signifiers of like this is a truck and this is a house and like it means X or this or that. Where now suddenly I was thinking about just like, okay, what does the negative space of a large open sky or a field convey in relationship to, this dwelling? And I think for me, large format helped with that because one gives you those controls, but at the same time, it like kind of keeps you in that meditative process.
That's wonderful. If you want, you can take us through your previous work there. That first line there.
Yeah, so this was the work I was making around the time I was doing that global art intervention, extraction art at the edge of the abyss. And in many ways, like this work was looking kind of for hope, right? Like I spent a lot of time working on that Hinterland series, thinking about all of these like heavy things from how our kind of water is being affected by kind of remnants of industry, how the economy is shifting. And I really just wanted to find like that hopeful nugget in the land, right? So in this, I was creating these landscapes that kind of reflected a kind of deeper geologic time. So looking at like how we would build cairns to more contemporary methods of like using pallets to move stone from different places. And it's definitely more kind of decorative. And all of this kind of with that idea in mind of, what's kind of left behind. But what I found interesting while kind of trying to look for those hopeful kind of little nuggets, like how difficult it is today to like really, there we go, how difficult it is to really like fully understand what you're seeing. So, while like hiking a mountain, you'll see like this natural erosion and it creates these marks on the land that you're like, oh, well, that's, geologic time kind of doing its thing. Yet you'll encounter something that seems as natural as that mountain peak. Yet, this image is entirely a mountain of slag. So for me, it was like trying to think about that longer time scale and find a little dash of hope in it. So the title of the work is called A Pool Among a Rock. It's actually a line from a T.S. Eliot poem I used to read in the summer quite a bit, where he kind of goes on talking about like that post-World War I landscape, right, where it's been war-torn, it's been bombed, pretty contaminated with gases and other kind of munitions. But we keeps going back to this idea of water and like essentially like if there was only this pool among a rock. I won't try to like paraphrase or read the poem on here, but I do encourage people to check it out because it does have that reflection of looking back at something that feels familiar. So an image like this feels so familiar in many ways, where you're just on the shore looking out at water. Yet here we're seeing, that acid lake from the Butte, Montana and the Berkeley Pit. And we're literally seeing it from the viewing platform they built so people could come and see this space. So for me, like it feels like this moment where our etymology is kind of failing us. So like, what word do I use to describe this, or the slag pile? Or in some ways, like an image like this, like we sort of know how to deal with in many ways, because it's like, oh yeah, that's just like this old buoy in the dried up area of the Great Salt Lake. We kind of understand how to deal with this on our time scale, because like we've all kind of seen a reservoir retreat in winter, fill up again in spring. But what happens when it doesn't fill up again in spring and it just continues to dry? So for me, it was really like taking more of a poetic kind of removal from the politics, just to kind of think about how we interact here and how we kind of deal with it maybe more poetically or linguistically than we would like getting into like the weeds of like, well, we're shipping stuff this way and we need to change it that way. And more just thinking about that kind of like those prairie images. What's it like to sit in this space with this object and just think about deeper time?
Yeah. It's almost as if the world and nature itself is claiming it back. It's claiming it back and bringing it back. And even though we intervene so what looks like ferociously, it's still bringing it back. And I think it's fascinating. That first image where the rock pile, you had a name for that. What was the name for that?
Oh, slag. Essentially, it's when you're
the rock pile. It's the first one. It was
first one. Yeah, the cairns.
You called it something. Okay, yeah. That I love how it just kind of mimics the rest of the landscape. You know, your peaks behind, and it's got a beautiful irony in that
Yeah.
image. It's a great one to start with. It's fantastic.
Yeah, and I think for me, it like goes back to that very human need of like just moving material around the land for our needs, right? And I think it goes back to like the earliest like humans that we have on record, right? And how they would interact with their landscape and shape it. So I think for me, it's like that like acknowledgement of kind of who we are as a species in nature. Often I think we separate those two, and I find that's where a lot of our conflict comes from not necessarily viewing ourselves as part of that system.
That's so true. Steve, we've had many conversations about this idea of supremacy. And a lot of our conflict comes
Mm.
from our idea of supremacy, like we are supreme over nature. We have conquered nature, and so therefore we are separate from it, but we are definitely products of it. And so it's this contrast that we find ourselves in, and you're exactly right. I think it's this idea that we think we are on top of nature when we really aren't. we're kind of
Yeah.
um, we're kind of in it, and I love your reflection on it. What was the name
Yeah.
of that poem?
Oh, it's from T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. So it's from that kind of fifth section of it. Yeah, pretty long
Okay,
poem for
okay.
poetry, but
So our
classic.
listeners can go and find it, and they can
Yeah.
go and reflect on that work and see all that connection. That's wonderful. Um, I do have one question for you is as we wrap up on this, and you are a teacher these days, and you are teaching art, and I'm curious, what do you think is kind of influencing artists today? Do you think our image culture today is heavily influencing us? What do you think is going on as I shift away from your projects
Yeah.
a little bit?
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a great thing that's on my mind a lot, especially with my student demographic. I teach a lot of our non-photo majors, so it's like our engineering students, our literature majors, our nursing majors. And like it's interesting seeing people who don't like come to art or consider themselves artists and seeing how visually literate they are versus areas that they don't feel comfortable like saying they understand. So it's something I'm definitely like always thinking about in class critiques and in my lectures, like, oh, how are they going to handle like a Joel Peter Witkins photograph in today's context, you know? And I find it kind of inspiring in some ways, like how many of them just get it without needing this long academic kind of justification of why this is art. They're just like, oh yeah, no, that makes sense. Or I'll show them some Cindy Sherman portraits like that clown series, and they're like, oh yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Oh, that would be a fun thing to do. And you're just like, wow, you guys are like way ahead of like what I remember in art school, where people would like I don't know, have a bit more attention to certain ideas. But I think it comes from that, like how much time people
That's
spend on social
fascinating.
media.
That is absolutely
Yeah,
fascinating. I haven't heard it from that perspective before. I've kind of I've come to this. Me and Steve and I, we actually have this conversation all the time, and we're talking about, we haven't been equipped to understand this image world to per se, but when you're inundated with it, you try to make sense of it. And so even if you're not a part of it, you kind of develop your own type of literacy. Do you feel like people are kind of accurate in their way of interpreting images, or do you think you are kind of helping point the ship in a different direction?
I definitely am pointing people to other directions a lot. But I think so much of it is we feel so equipped for our understanding how we feel about it and like discussing like our own knowledge base within an image. So when you ask someone, let's shift our lens of interpretation a little bit. How might someone coming from a different culture approach this? I think that's where people really find like they feel challenged by those ideas in a way that ever remember being in school, it would seem like, oh yeah, that's pretty normal. Change your lens of interpretation. People view things differently. But now I think they use that more as a dismissive device than one that helps them extend how they understand
Mm.
something. So it's like, well, the number of times I hear in a semester, well, anything can mean anything. And I'm like, it can until like we get one fact. And then suddenly that's narrowed what this is about, right? You know, suddenly now like this landscape isn't a still life in a studio, right? Because we have that horizon. Now we're dealing with a different kind of visual elements. So I find as students have time to speak about it, they get really into it. Like the number of times I hear like how much people love critique, which blows my mind as someone who went through a pretty had some really great instructors, but I remember critique was something you like emotionally prepared for. And now my students are showing up with smiles like, oh, I can't wait to like see everyone's stuff and talk about it. I'm like, I'm glad this is the energy.
I loved your answer there. You had said something that until you add another fact in, it doesn't, you know what I mean? Now it doesn't just mean anything. And I think
Yeah.
that is really, really strong. I love that because, you know, everyone's like, well, you can interpret it in any way you want to. And so it's a wonderful answer. My next question is, you know, you're teaching other majors that aren't art majors, but you yourself were not an art major when you took your first photography class. Have you converted anybody?
Mhm. Oh man, yeah. I feel bad sometimes because like
You're
there
like,
is a
oh,
nursing shortage and like the number of like students who are going into nursing who are like, I think photography is the way I should go. And I'm like, I'm really happy you're converting, but I also feel a little bad. I usually get a few a semester that just like, I think like that knob switches and they're like, yeah, I should walk away from this now while I'm still in school and have the support of like a full faculty who can like get them ready to be a photographer. But definitely feel guilty sometimes.
well, you know, once you get that bug, but the other thing
Yeah.
is too, it doesn't even matter how much you try to force fit into another way of life. You know, it calls you back. It one way or another, you can deny it all you want, but you're going to end up there anyway. That leads me to my next question, and this is the last question I like to ask everybody. A lot of my audience is people that are involved in the arts and they're photographers themselves, maybe image makers themselves, and I'm curious, you know, since you have worked with students, um, do you have any advice for anybody up and coming that wants to be an image maker?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many like different things I tell young photographers or even just emerging photographers, of all ages. But the number one thing I find that makes or breaks like your success and like getting what you want out of it is leaning into your community, whether that be, just the photographers in your town. Maybe that's getting involved in an online group of people and just like chatting via Instagram or some social media, because you really aren't alone in this field, which is really quite beautiful that you can connect with someone on the internet on the other side of the world who's been thinking all the same things you have been about this idea as it relates to art or photography. So I would really encourage people to like go out, extend your fingers, your reach into all those little pockets, see what communities like you interact well with, and like really like foster that around you.
I think that is so true because this is evidence of that. Montana
Yeah,
and Paris, France.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
we're definitely doing that. So that's great advice. The last little moment here is I'm giving you an opportunity. If people want to find you, how do they reach out to you? Do they find you on Instagram or on your website? How can people connect with you?
Yeah, definitely check out my website. I'm always pretty communicative on there. If you send me an email, you'll see a lot of the work out there. But also, don't be afraid to slide into my DMs on an Instagram. I feel like most artists I keep in touch with are through that platform. So, and then, yeah, send me a message, check out the work on there. I tend to post a lot of behind the scenes. So,
So is it just Ryan Parker?
oh, yeah, the handle. I always forget that part. It's RK Parker 4.
RK Parker
There's a lot of
4.
Ryan
Okay,
Parkers
perfect.
out there. Yeah.
Yeah, there are. There's a musician out there. I found.
Yeah.
And so I guess a pianist or somebody, and I was like, no, I don't think this is him.
Yeah.
I don't think this is him.
Yeah.
So it's to find you, it's ryanparker.info, and that's your website for your
Yeah.
work. Well, thank you so
Correct.
much for
Yeah.
joining us today. I had a wonderful conversation with you.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. I loved the conversation, getting to talk about all of this. It's been wonderful.
Thank you so much again. And to all those who have made it this far, thank you so much for joining us. And if you like this content, please consider liking, sharing, and also commenting down below. This helps us with the algorithm. And if you want to support content like this, join our patreon.com page by becoming a member on our Patreon page. And as always, we'll see you next time.